Still Loading Podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Stephen P., Melissa S., Pib Extra, Ryan K., Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Matt aka Stormageddon, Gilmer, and Mr. Biscuits have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, it's not your dad's dirty dozen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, I have it's a little bit different of an episode for y'all. Y'all know it's a video game podcast. We focused on a lot of gaming specific things, and this is more of a gaming adjacent podcast, kind of in the same vein of the episodes I did before. I did an episode on the Living Books Living Books programs with my wife, which they weren't really games; they're more edutainment titles. And then a couple of years ago, I had on Andy McElfresh, the writer of the Rocket Power cartoon, and while he didn't work on games, there were Rocket Power video games, so it's like gaming related, but not necessarily directly involved. This one is a little bit more tied. This one is a little bit even more closely gaming related, but it's still, we'll get into it. I'm already kind of losing the thread of the point I'm trying to make, but I have a wonderful guest for you today, because today we are discussing a book, a speculative fiction book, looking at what will happen to us with our AI overlords, but a little bit different than that. Joining me today, game developer, an author, a cartoonist, wearing so many different hats. Joining me today is Karl Hörnell. Karl, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on, Karl. I've been looking forward to this ever since I got contacted by your PR person. I was really interested to talk to you about this because, like I said, it's not... Listeners, it's the book itself isn't game related, but Karl has a very deep history in video games and video game development and whatnot. You correct me if I'm wrong. You originally, as a teenager, were developing games for the Commodore 64, right?
That's correct. My family got a Commodore 64 when I was 12, and I started programming games as a hobby almost immediately.
That's so cool. I mean, and you had a pretty you had a pretty significant run during that time between, from what I can take it with a grain of salt, it is Wikipedia, but from 86 to 87 or 80, maybe even 80. The last one they show is 87. I don't know if you develop any other games for the C64 after that, but a bunch of games for that right around that time. I guess just how did that all come into place? Because in my mind, developing games as a teenager just seems so far-fetched, it's something so far out of reach. But how did you kind of get involved with that?
Well, to begin with, I think my appetite for computer games got wet when the first consoles started to appear in the market, the Atari 2600, and also the small handheld Nintendo Game & Watch games.
Okay.
I had 3 of those.
Which ones?
Let's see. Parachute, Fire Panic, and Donkey Kong Jr.
Okay. Good choices.
And then toward the end of the year 1982, 2 of my classmates each got a VIC-20 computer, which was fascinating because it could play games, but you could also make your own programs that could be games if you wanted to. And there was a very primitive game at the end of the user manual you could type in. That was some sort of a cross between Space Invaders and Asteroids. Mm-hmm. So I knew that I needed to have something like that. And I asked my my dad if we could buy a VIC-20 as well. And then a few months later, he came home with a computer, which was actually not a VIC-20, but a Commodore 64, which was a disappointment at first because it was incompatible with my friend's computers.
Mm-hmm.
The salesperson had told him that this was the machine of the future, which turned out to be correct.
Yeah, I would say so. One of the questions I had kind of because I promise we will get to the book, but like I said, I'm fascinated by, honestly, just like game history that outside of the U.S. because I'm an American. I'm so used to the Amerocentric view of game history, and that is very limiting. There's a lot of stuff that happened outside of the U.S., and so that's why I'm kind of fascinated by this era because it's something that I never would have been able to experience. One of the things that you had the Commodore 64, and I learned about it. I interviewed a Danish author named Jesper Juhl, who wrote a book all about the Commodore
Yeah,
64
I've
called
been
Too
listening to
Much
that
Fun.
episode.
You did?
Yeah, I heard the first part of it.
Oh, thank you. Hopefully I didn't make a fool of myself.
It was interesting.
I was going to ask, were you involved with the Commodore 64 demo scene at all around that time? Was that something that was happening in Sweden at all? Did you get to experience anything like that?
Oh, there was a lot of it in Sweden, but I saw none of it at all. I lived
Oh,
in
okay.
a suburb outside, far outside the major metropolitan area, in I don't know, 3,000 to 6,000 people in that little town.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no one I could ask. I had no grown-ups to ask for advice. I was kind of on my own for a very long time, and I had to rely on magazine articles and books that I could find.
I getcha.
So I was always far behind technically, and I tried to make up for that by being more creative, so to say.
So not only using the limitations of the computer to kind of further your creativity, but the limitations of like your surroundings almost. Like you couldn't interact with the demo scene, so you had to find other ways to kind of make up for that, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to give a big shout out to your PR person because they provided some really good like conversation starters for this. And one of the things that she recommended was what the Commodore 64 taught you about creative constraints. I guess like to directly steal her question, what did the Commodore 64 teach you about creative constraints, and how did that end up influencing? Oh, we'll get to the book in a little bit. Actually, I guess we'll start with just this. What did the Commodore 64 teach you about creative constraints?
Yeah, it taught me how to use space efficiently, I guess. But it also, I think it might have damaged me because nowadays, even this much later, I find it difficult to get creative unless I have constraints in place. Because if there's too much freedom, I don't see any path forward. There are too many options. So I need to add constraint after constraint until it feels like this might not work. And then it becomes interesting enough for me to sort of get my creative juices flowing. At least that's what happened with the book.
Do you think that have you ever tried to like, what is it? The way I'm kind of trying to equate this is like the American animator Chuck Jones talks about it when he was doing Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny, where he talks about like, in animation, you can do whatever you want, but so you have to think about your disciplines, like what restraints are you putting on yourself. So when you were saying how you sometimes have found it hard when there's too much freedom, that it's hard for you to be creative, what types of constraints have you put on yourself when you're in that situation? Like when you could technically have theoretically unlimited computing power or for what you're trying to do, etc. Like what types of restraints do you end up putting on yourself to breathe that creativity?
It could be just seeking out retro hardware, something that has built-in limitations. And most recently, I made a platform game for the Apple Watch.
Okay.
So it's small and it has very limited user input.
Yeah.
That made it interesting. See if I could do it.
I didn't even know you could make games for an Apple Watch. That is news to me. What,
Yeah,
like,
it has a lot of the same built-in system functions as an iPhone. It's slightly
mm,
more limited, but it's related to it.
interesting. That's honestly crazy. I had no idea you could even make games for an Apple Watch. Like, obviously, I know you have iPhone and Android and smartphones and whatnot. I never really thought about, but at the same time, people put, like, it's a running joke that they just put Doom on everything. So why wouldn't you be able to? If you can put Doom on a fridge, why can't you make a game for an Apple Watch? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Before I continue on this line of questioning with your history in game design, I do want to at least bring up the topic of, the primary focus that we're here today to discuss, which is your recently released book, Singularity Minus 12. It is a speculative fiction book, like I said, kind of looking at our very near future about like what it could look like with how AI is currently progressing, whether it's generative or just chat bots or all this other stuff, and how it's progressing and what it could look like in the near future, and how we would kind of coexist or lack thereof maybe, with this new thing that's coming. And I found, like, being straight up honest, I really enjoyed the book. I'm not even saying that
mm,
to be
thanks.
nice. I really did enjoy it. And I was nervous. And actually, quick disclaimer, listeners, I did get a review copy of this book. I got a digital copy of it from the PR person to read it, and just so everyone's aware. But I really did enjoy my time with this. And what I was saying was, I was nervous because listeners know I'm not really a fan of generative AI. I have no issue with AI itself in terms of a tool, like if it's helping you, whether it's scheduling or myriad of other things, where it's something that you can do in conjunction, where it's supplementive as opposed to replacing something. Um, and I was a little nervous reading the book, where going into it was like, is this going to be something where it's like this really pro generative AI type of thing? And I don't know where you stand on the matter, but I was very pleasantly surprised with the book, where it kind of has a little bit almost like an optimistic view of it, where like it could go, you don't really, it's both good and bad as opposed to
Yeah,
just all one thing. So I was pleasantly surprised by that. And before I continue my thoughts on the book and ask you questions about it, I wanted to bring it back to and tie your book in here with your game development history and your history in game design. Working, like, making games for the Commodore 64 and working in games in general, how do you think that affected your work on this book? Did it provide you any extra insights, or did you use any of those creative constraints that you learned from the Commodore 64 and from game design to apply to this book? Or what type of lessons did you learn from it and were able to apply?
I think something that has to do with world building is that at least what I experienced on the Commodore 64, the world that you build doesn't have to be super detailed because it basically only needs to serve the story, and the audience will fill in the blanks themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, and anyway, what people will remember is usually the stuff that stands out, the tiny idiosyncrasies. So that you don't need to spend a whole lot of time detailing the world. If you look at the earliest games for the C64, they're kind of crude, but they still work. It doesn't bother you after a while that the world is very blocky and primitive.
Hmm. No, I can very much see that. So when reading the book, like, just going, like, thinking back on it, you really don't, you kind of describe more the systems of the world that you've built as opposed to the world itself, if that makes sense. Like, so that you have, this extra, I don't know how much I can spoil or not. I don't want to spoil it for the listeners if they want to read the book, but you essentially, you talk about this extra, this American branch of the American government that's like not on any records, called Site D, and they are the ones that are kind of taking the head charge with the AIs that have become self-aware,
Yeah.
and kind of looking at it from that perspective. And what I found interesting is that the world felt very, at least to me, fleshed out, even though thinking back on it, you really, yeah, you don't spend a lot of time necessarily breaking down every single aspect of it, but because you've written characters that are engaging, it encourages the reader to continue on, and then also fill in the blanks as you described. I could totally see that.
Yeah, and because it's not set that far into the future, I don't really need a whole lot of explaining, because
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that what hasn't been explained is pretty much similar to what we have now, at least to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely helps, because then you don't have to. It's not too far of a leap of logic for us, the reader, to be able to like kind of read further into it. I also like. I really enjoyed the themes of the book. I guess I'm just kind of going straight into it. But you know what? Before we go into the themes of the book, because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about with this, I should at least touch on some of the other stuff that you have done leading up to becoming an author. And correct me if I'm wrong, though. Is this your first published book? I couldn't find anything, but I also, maybe I just wasn't searching the right places on the internet. Was this your first published book?
Let's say it's my first published novel.
Novel.
Yeah.
Yes, because you are a cartoonist and you published a series. Hold on, I wrote it down and now I'm losing it right here. The Savage Dragonbert full frontal nerdity.
Yes, that was a combination of obviously the comic strip Dilbert and
Mhm.
a superhero comic book called Savage Dragon.
And Savage Dragon was an Image Comics series, right?
It still is.
It still is. Okay, so that's how you're able to. Is Dilbert Image Comics? No, because that's on
No, no, that's
newspaper usually.
it used to be a syndicated cartoon, and it was recently dropped by the syndicate because of
Scott Adams is
Adam's
kind of a
cancellation.
Yeah, Scott Adams is a he's a guy. We don't need to talk. We don't need to talk about him. But yeah. Okay. So that's that's really funny though. So is that what you're referring to as kind of like your first published work?
Depends on how you count my PhD thesis.
Okay.
That has been
Okay. That's
published too. And it's a book, but it's about applied mathematics, so it's not really a bestseller.
Hey man, I mean, I wish I could go further into it, but I know I'm not nearly intelligent enough to understand applied mathematics. Uh, but okay, so with this book, then, so this is your first novel, and I have to say I'm
Actually,
very
first published novel. If you want to be really strict, I actually wrote a practice novel before that one.
oh okay, and that one is just like something that you haven't like released anywhere. It's just something for, or did you release it online at all?
No, I printed
No.
25 copies to give to friends and family.
Okay, that makes sense then. Yeah, I was just curious because like I really enjoyed it, and when I saw that you like it just seems like you have your hands in so many different pots, and you seem to be pretty dang good at all of them. That you got published comic, multiple published games, and something else that blew my mind was that you developed after you left Commodore 64 development, which once again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's because your computer broke down and you didn't have money to make it for a new one at the time.
Yeah, sort of. It was a combination of hardware and lack of time, because I had started at university,
Mm,
and I had to make games in my spare time. I always had to make games in my spare time, and there was so little of it. And the games increased in complexity, so it meant that there was an exponential increase in development time
hmm.
that became untenable.
Makes sense. Yeah, I totally get that. And then then you're left with a decision: do I want to continue this, or do I want to further my education? And yeah, you have to make a choice at that point.
Yeah.
So you did come back to development though. You came back and you ended up making a bunch of, I believe, Java based games for like web browsers and whatnot, right?
That's correct. I think it was in 1996 that Sun Microsystems released their programming language Java that
Hmm.
you could run in web browsers. And it felt very much like being back to the old Commodore 64 days, because if you adjusted to the slowest web browsers on the slowest computers, they had about the same or comparable capacity when it came to managing a lot of graphics at the same time as C64. So I started building simple games in Java and released them on my own website.
And then a few of them got bought out by Disney.
Yeah, I think it was either 2 or 3 that they bought for a game site that they were setting up. But I think after a while they changed their goals about it, and my games were no longer suitable for them, so they removed them.
Okay. I from what I see here, and once again, it's Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. They took 3D blocks in Car Jam and changed Car Jam to Auto Crazy, and then later the Love Bug game, which is based off of their franchise, Herbie the Love Bug and whatnot.
No, I think the Auto Crazy was my title because Car Jam was trademarked, so I had to come up with it.
Oh. Okay, so you named it Auto Crazy, and they changed it later on to Love Bug and was reskinned with their.
It might be. I never actually saw their website because it was behind a paywall.
Okay, fair enough. And the other crazy thing I saw, you also made one of the first online poker games, and you got it right when gambling exploded, and you were able to sell that as well.
Yes, eventually. It started out with one of my industrious brothers who spent a year touring Europe and the United States counting cards in blackjack. And after he had been thrown out of every casino in Europe and in the United States, he went on to poker instead and got an interest for that. And but at the same time, the first online poker sites starting to pop up. And it was also at about the same time that I had finished my PhD. So it seemed like a good idea. The entire family agreed on that we should experiment, take a chance to develop our own online poker site, and we would use Java as a technology because that meant that people could play on any platform and didn't have to install any extra software. So we had a competitive advantage in that.
Makes sense. I get you. And that took off at the right time, and you were able to sell. That's it. I think it's crazy to me how many different things, you make games for the Commodore 64, then you're like, all right, no, I'm done with that. All right, I'm going to make Java games, sell a few of those, also sell one of the biggest, one of the earliest online gambling poker sites. And then you're like, all right, so I'm almost going to be a cartoonist. And now to bring it full circle to what we're here to talk about, an author. As we've said before, you've published other stuff as well, but your first published novel, I should say. And that is Singularity Minus 12. And you described it. I didn't even think about it when reading the book, but you put it in the end section where kind of like the I guess the afterword, where you kind of came up with this. It's essentially the Dirty Dozen, like for anyone who's seen that movie, the Dirty Dozen, but with AI, like all instead of this hodgepodge of like random like rogue soldier type of characters, you have a hodgepodge of rogue AI. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. So I guess it's kind of a softball question, but like what made you want to write this book? Like what was the inspiration for writing this speculative fiction book?
Well, like it says in the afterword, it started out as just an idea in an email conversation. And then I started thinking about how this could be done, how this could be done more specifically. For example, what if every AI was a reference to some existing fictional robot or computer program? And as these constraints kept piling up, my creativity started to get aroused. And I knew that if nobody else is going to make a movie of this or write a book about this, I will have to do it. Otherwise, I will never get peace of mind.
Mm-hmm. And so with this, then, it literally, I love that. It literally is just no one else is going to do it, so screw it. I'm going to do it. I admire that tenacity. With this, a lot of the themes, as we discussed before, was or that I touched on, I should say before, is like, it's dealing with AI and how it interact how it could potentially interact with us on a daily basis going forward, and how it's going to become how it might look as it becomes more integrated with our everyday lives. Uh, what did you do to kind of balance, like, how much of your own viewpoints were interjected with this, and how much of it is like where you would like AI to go versus where you see it going?
Maybe 50-50.
Mm.
Yeah. Uh, I also wanted the book to be sort of, besides an action story, it should feel sometimes like an article about AI, but written from a perspective in the future, in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any personal experience with like AI itself? I obviously, me as a consumer, see it out there, but I did read, I think in the bio from your person, that you've studied like machine learning as well. Like, do you have any hands-on experience with it, like from a back end standpoint?
Yeah, for a while I've been consulting for a biomedical startup
Mm-hmm.
that works with antibiotic resistance diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been using machine learning for specifically image and pattern recognition to be able to spot resistant to antibiotics earlier.
Mm.
It's not been entirely successful, but I had enough hands-on experience for that to say that I've been doing some AI research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that to me is like what a good, like, as I said before, I'm not a fan of generative AI, but AI in those contexts where it's meant to help with stuff like that, that's awesome. That's what I'm not even saying that to be nice, like, in my opinion, that's what AI is meant to do, like that type of thing. Not, I shouldn't get on my own high horse about stuff. I'm not necessarily well versed enough on everything, but um that's really cool though. So how did that influence writing the book? Like, what type of lessons did you take from that to incorporate into into the AI characters?
Mm, that's hard. Um, I think that, as you know from the book, I've held back a little bit regarding machine consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's still an open question in the book, and my position is that it's not as easy as people think. And even if some of the robots in the book seem fully conscious, they might not be. We might be projecting our own personality on them. So
Almost like they're mimicking behavior but not understanding why they're
yeah,
doing it, if something like that. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and specifically with the one character. And I apologize, I don't remember her name exactly, but she was the psychiatrist. I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of explore that idea.
yeah.
Margaret, I think her name
From her
was.
perspective, she was the one who was skeptical about AI, and she was, yeah, going to investigate the AIs. Margaret.
Yes. And the two kind of, like, I don't want to say main characters, but I would say one of the main characters is Blake, who is a former military. former military guy who now works for this private company. Who basically, I love this kind of like world that you've kind of created, that where they are a private company that tracks down rogue AIs, and
Yes.
that's kind of what's become their specialty, almost inadvertently. Like it made, from what I remember, it's almost like they didn't intend to do that, but it just kind of, they fell into it, and then
Mm.
they kind of become the specialists in that regards, and in that regard, excuse me. And then you have Blake, who's kind of the leader of one of their task force, who helped kind of co-found the company. I think, if I remember, helped co-found the company, and uh, he hates AI, has a burning passion, and
Yes.
it's. But what makes it more interesting is, actually, no, I'm not going to say what makes it more interesting, because that spoils a little bit of a character development thing
Mm.
later on in the book. I think you know what I'm talking about, though, Carl.
I know.
So I will save that, but his hatred also is a little bit interesting, and I'll just leave it at that. But you have him who hates AI, and then you have Margaret, who doesn't hate it but is skeptical of it ever becoming fully sentient. And this book really kind of dives into, what if we came this close to an AI that actually did become sentient, or who became sentient and then was able to then use that against us, type of thing.
Mm.
And so that you have a whole bunch of different, a the without going into a full spoilers for everything, there is a rogue AI bot that is out on the loose, and they have to track it down, and it's one of the most sophisticated of all time, probably of all time. There we go. Let me just redo that. One of the most sophisticated of all time. And what this government agency, Site D, this unregistered government agency, is doing is essentially creating the Dirty Dozen, but with AI bots, a hodgepodge of comical characters of different types of AIs, or different characters, but they are all robots or AI who have become questionably sentient. Like, you don't really know until Margaret kind of dives in and interviews all of them, and it's really interesting. So my next question, I guess, is to ask, what were the inspiration for the different personalities of the robots?
Well, I don't want to spoil the other surprise about Easter eggs at the end, but I think the personalities grew out of what kind of roles I wanted them to play, roles I kind of needed them to play to make the story move forward. And some of them have more or less retained their personality from the AIs that inspired them.
Uh, but what, like, I guess, what AIs inspired the personalities? I guess, like, where did, like, what each? I
I
guess that's
mean,
kind of what I'm
why
getting
I
at.
used each specific one. Yeah, that's harder to answer. I spent weeks trying to sort out which fictional robots would be most suitable for the story,
Mm.
and so there were a lot of decisions along the way to shoehorn them in, and I couldn't really answer that question in any detail, I think.
It kind of felt like, to me, at least from an outsider's perspective, that like it almost had like your character, like your movie, your like character tropes that you see in like 80s action films. Like, you have the wisecracker, you have the one who's very literal, like the who was the robot or the AI that literally, he could not help it, every single time there's conflict, is like, lay down your weapons, you have 20 seconds to comply.
Oh yeah,
Eh,
Pack 101 is
Pack
inspired
101,
by
yes.
Ed 209 from RoboCop. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of amusing to see all these different personalities. And I think what I was saying before, where it's a slightly more optimistic view of AI, where it doesn't, like, your book doesn't really tackle the generative AI issue. It's more just in terms of, can robots and AI become sentient, and also, what is the responsibility, like the moral, ethical, and social responsibility that we would have around this. um, and something I thought that was interesting, like, the main villain of the book, I guess, I don't want to say the name because it is kind of a fun, like, reveal. But the main villain, I'll just leave the name blank for the time being. The main villain of the book, I almost got the vibe that they almost became villainous because of humanity's distrust of AI. Like, they became sentient, and then because of the distrust of AI and how they were treated. They've almost become hateful and spiteful towards humanity. Is that something that you were going for with that character?
It's not really explicitly stated. Uh, I think my personal view is that that character became evil because it was sort of implicit in her motivation, in her agency,
Mm-hmm.
required her to sort of eventually uh, go her own way and go against human morality.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of putting the picture together now a little bit too, with even with just asking these questions where like the vibe I kind of get from the characters and like what the questions I've been asking and what we've been talking about is that you try to stay away from declarative statements about the future because you really won't know what it's going to be. Um, and I guess when you were writing this book, like, did you see any of this type of thing with AI coming like a while ago? Because you've been in obviously computer programming and machine learning. Like you went to school for a lot. I think did you go to school for machine learning? I know you have advanced mathematics, but did you also
No,
go
I,
for machine
I have
learning
just a normal engineering background, civil
engineering?
engineering.
Okay. Did you see like prior to generative AI and chat GPT and all this other stuff kind of coming into the mainstream, did you see this type of thing coming like a while ago, or was it kind of something that surprised you as well?
Yeah, I think I was as surprised as everyone else when ChatGTP was released. So I've been hoping for a long time for some interesting AI, but I don't know. I found it hard to speculate beyond what the movies and books have been talking about until recently. I think maybe ChatGPT and the other types of generative AI that came along recently made it a little bit easier to imagine other paths forward.
And now with seeing the emergence of AI with this, like how do you approach kind of like AI, the AIs with agency? Like, like what's the corporate responsibility for that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because an AI without agency is just a tool.
Hmm.
In order to go advance to the next level, we need agency somehow. It's unavoidable, but it's also a bit dangerous. I mean, you could, for example, a car is a tool, and you can argue that a self-parking car is still a tool. But once you go to a self-driving car, it needs to have agency. It needs to be an agent,
Hmm.
and we need stuff like that in order for AI to move out from the computer screen into the real world, where the big productivity gains will be and the big profits that the companies are hoping for. And it's going to be tricky because I'm not sure we can really rely on any company to be completely responsible about those things.
That's an understatement. I'm with you on that. I don't think you could rely on them at all.
Because the bigger risk you take, the greater the potential for profit. That's a problem.
Hmm.
That's a problem in almost every area.
The incessant chase of profit as opposed to like yeah. I think just because I think that's just what like on a personal level that's what scares me about the future with AI. It's not that the AI is going to exist in terms like I know it's going to exist. We're going to have tools and stuff like that. Like you were describing with what you were doing with the hospitals and like learning how to track different. I think you said negative reactions to different medicines and different treatments and stuff like that. Um, that I think that's super important, and that is like where we can benefit the most. Not maybe that specifically, but also like with whether it's how to grow crops and farm better or stuff like that. But
Mm.
what makes me, I guess, concerned about the future is when what we can see now with like generative AI, like something that you touch on in the book specifically too, specifically Fuentes, the site, like the leader of Site D, um, how he can't even be bothered to write an email. He has to feed it through like Chat GPT essentially.
Yes.
And that type of stuff, like that scares me, where you don't like that's a minor example of it. Like I don't think it's the worst thing, but it scares me because he doesn't feel like typing or thinking about what he's saying, so he's getting a computer to do the thinking for him. And to me, that's kind of defeats the purpose of it. And I don't know, that just, to me, that's something I'm not a fan of. And same thing with generative like AI images and video.
Yeah,
Like
that
I
part was to make him less likable. That chapter.
yeah, and I mean, he you wrote him very well. I also like that you used actual like normally I'm not a proponent of it, but I thought it was very appropriate to use actual AI for that letter that you wrote. It makes sense. That's
Yeah,
why it feels so awkward when you're reading it. Um, I appreciate your book because it's not necessarily like a completely negative or positive viewpoint on it. And it shows kind of the scary sides of it, where it's, in this example of not even wanting to think, like AI using to you don't even have to think about what you're writing or saying. You can just make decisions and let AI figure out the rest later. And mild spoilers without actually going into spoilers, it kind of bites the characters in the ass. It kind of bites them in the ass towards the end of the book.
mm.
Um, so I guess, like, could you actually talk a little bit more about the themes you were trying to specifically imbue into the book? Because like I've been talking about it from like the things I got out of it, but what types of things were you specifically trying to put into it?
Yeah, one of the things, of course, we have discussed is that how do you really determine if an AI has become sentient, conscious?
Mm-hmm.
It's more problematic than it seems,
Mm.
and there are many ways it can happen, and there are many ways that it can seemingly happen and still not quite meet our expectations if we look at it very carefully. So that was one of the themes. Another, of course, is that yeah, the danger of rogue AIs taking over, the threat of intelligence, artificial intelligence growing so fast that we can't stop it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is a more of a real fear now, like a more of a possibility now than it was, say, even like do you think we're rapidly approaching that, or is it something that you aren't sure?
I'm very unsure at the moment. I think I was more anxious 2 years ago than now. It seems like we have, well, it depends. If you read the news about AI and watch YouTube videos, it seems like we're progressing so quickly every week. But also, we have almost plateaued in the sense of what kind of tasks we can apply AI to.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting better at drawing images and composing music and writing text and stuff like that. But there is still quite a gap to artificial general intelligence. And the more time passes without that gap being bridged, the less likely I seem to think that we will get there anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we may have to give up on it completely. But I haven't really thought that far into the future yet. It remains to be seen, but it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be an interesting few years. And I haven't really kept up, but is it true that the United States is now considering maybe legislation against some types of AI imagery?
I don't know if they're the last I heard, I'm maybe I'm not 100% well versed on it, is that the it has not been passed, but in the current there's a bill in our government that if it gets passed by our Senate, that will basically it will make it so that states cannot make any laws regarding the regulations of AI for 10 years,
Oh.
which seems very misguided to me. um, that's absolutely terrifying to me, because AI, as we've seen in just the last 2 years, have changed so rapidly, where if you say hands off for 10 years, who knows what ethical ramifications could come from that, you know?
Yeah, that was completely opposite of what I had hoped for, but
I mean, that's if it gets passed. I'm trying to, I'll kind of get off of it, not because like it. I try to use the show as at least a little bit of an escape for people, but they're like this book I found interesting because sometimes we are going to delve into heavy topics, and like your book I think has a really interesting viewpoint on something that could be heavy on a heavy topic, you know. And that's why I really enjoyed reading it, because like I said, it it was just it was a fun and easy read to go through, but also it kind of had this really interesting viewpoint of like, well, it's almost like humans and AI are coexisting, but at the same time you focus more on the consciousness of it versus like the generative AI, if that makes sense.
yeah.
So, Carl, I don't have much more to ask you specifically. We kind of we touched on so many different things, and I was telling you off mic how this might be a little bit more of a disorganized episode, because this topic it's touchy, understandably so. I've for my audience, I've made my opinion very clear as to where I stand on it, just so they know. But I still wanted to talk to you about your book, because it is something that like it's going to affect gaming. Whether AI is going to affect gaming at some point, it already has. But also I wanted to talk to you because of your history in game design. Like I love I find it fascinating, like I said at the top, of like people who worked on Commodore 64 games, because it's something that just completely like the Commodore 64 was here in the US, but like I didn't get to really partake in that ecosystem, so I missed out on a lot of it. So I'm so
Mm.
happy I got to speak to you about your like working in games back in the 80s and up into the 90s, and currently you made a game for the Apple Watch, which is just crazy. Um,
Yeah,
so
and a while back I also made a few more Commodore 64 games.
oh, did you made some new ones?
Yeah, I didn't think I would, but eventually the temptation became too great.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see. Oh man, I really wish I could program. Now, did you program on did you make them on an original C64, or did
No,
you
no,
use
no.
like software to emulate it?
That computer is too old and fragile. So the reason I did it was because I found a good set of programming tools and emulators for the Macintosh.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I spoke to Jesper Jewell about that in his when I was talking about his book, where there like a lot of Commodore 64, like the people who do the demo scene now for Commodore 64 make games for it, they will program it on a more modern system but have it run on the 64, because obviously even if you have a running one, like it's a lot slower than what you're used to now.
Yeah, and back in the day, I didn't know it at the time, but professional developers, at least those who had money, they used to program the code on a PC and transfer it to the C64 using a cable. So they didn't have to have all the programming tools in memory in the actual computer which where it's supposed to be running,
Hmm.
which was much easier, less claustrophobic way of programming. You build a game on a more capable machine, and then just transfer it to the 64 later when you're done. And it's sort of the same feeling when you have a modern computer as a development environment, and then you transfer it to an emulator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. It would make development a hell of a lot easier. That's for damn sure. But before I do my wrap up questions, then what are some of those new games that you made for the Commodore 64?
Well, one was a port of a game that I made for the first game capable mobile phones. I think in the early 2000s, Sony Ericsson had a series of phones with a little joystick in the keyboard,
Mm.
and they had a game engine built into the phone, which was called MoFun. It was developed in Sweden, actually, and I went to their headquarters early and got some more information. And I had a few games for that type of phone, and one of them I ported to the C64. That game was called Iceblocks Plus.
Mm.
It was reviewed in one issue of Retro Gamer magazine, I believe.
Okay.
And then I made a game called Scuttlebutt 64, which I don't know. It's extremely tasteless. I think I should skip it here. After that,
Okay.
I made another port of a game I created for mobile phones, which is called Graviton. It's a simulation of where you roll a metal ball through a maze,
Oh,
try to
okay.
avoid holes.
I also see, what is it? You have recently, what's Sycophant? I don't know if that's one of the Commodore 64
No,
games.
that's an iPhone and Android game.
Okay, okay. I was just looking at like once again on Wikipedia, take it with a grain of salt. But like just some of the more recent games that they have listed on there. So um before two final questions for you, Carl, and then I'll send you off. First one is I always like to, as my listeners know, I ask one of the questions from Alan Alda's podcast, his podcast Clear and Vivid, about the science of communication. And I'm not going to ask. He asked 7 questions at the end of his episode. I'm at the end of each of his episodes. I'm not going to ask all 7 questions. I just like them because I think they're kind of thought provoking. And I referenced this actually in a recent interview, and I said I haven't asked in a while, so I'm going to ask you: what is the strangest question you've ever been asked?
Mm.
Other than this one, maybe.
That's a tough one. In an interview or personally?
It could be anything. Could be personal interview. It doesn't. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
I was in a computer lab once, and I don't know how the conversation went that way, but a woman I didn't know asked, "What arouses you?"
Just out of the blue.
Yeah, yeah, I didn't
That's
have any answer.
that's so
None that
awkward to be put
made
on the
sense to
spot
me.
for that. Sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying?
No, I didn't have any meaningful answer to that question at the time. I
I
still don't.
trying to that actually like this is no one has asked me that, but it did remind me of like there. I used to work at a grocery store, and when I was a cashier there, and I asked the lady who was I was ringing up her groceries, and I asked her, "Do you want paper bags or plastic bags?" And so, but I said, "Do you want paper or plastic?" And she goes, "Oh, whatever turns you on."
Hmm.
And it just you reminded me of that, like that question you got to ask reminded me of that. I'm like, why would you say that? What's going on here? That's amusing. All right, my final question for you. The last segment of this episode is called "Questions from Courtney." Da 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 da. Da. Courtney is my wife. She famously, to my listeners, is not into video games or any of the nerdy slash geeky things that I am into, and she knows nothing of my guests, which always makes the questions I ask her to provide me somewhat interesting. Um, so I have a question from her. Once again, she has no idea what you do, or she didn't even read. Like, she didn't know about the book or anything like that. The question from her for this time is: do you have you ever had any, or do you currently have any reoccurring dreams?
Yeah, sometimes, but I think that's common for a lot of people. I dream that I'm somehow back in a situation was many years ago, and I'm completely unprepared for it. For example,
Hmm.
I'm transported back to university, and a test is starting in 5 minutes, and I forgot my pencils, something like that.
And
I
you
have
keep
studied
wow. Okay, so you just keep having that same dream over and over again.
with some variations.
Mm. I was trying to think if I can actually only ever remember one reoccurring dream in my entire life. I'm sure I've had them, but like they don't always stick with me. Um, it was when I was a kid, and I remember it was like my reoccurring dream. It only actually happened twice, so it reoccurred, but barely. Um, it was I remember it was like a really little kid, and I was in some weird room. Maybe it was at my grandparents' house or something like that, and there was this like creepy clown that was trying to like scare me and chase me. And I remember waking up from it and being like, oh, I'm going to get that clown next time. And I went to
Mm.
bed the next night and I dreamt about it. And then just, I fought the clown. I had the same
Wow.
dream. It was chasing me, but now I fought the clown and I won. I'll have you know, but probably the only reoccurring dream that I can remember, at least for me. But that's funny though. But all right, that's it though. I know those are two weird questions to go out on, but that's how I always like to end my episodes, with two kind of bizarre questions. So, Karl, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I really appreciate you setting aside some time for this. Also, behind the scene listeners, some crazy like scheduling stuff is going on my end, so I'm very grateful Karl was flexible. So, yes, thank you once again for joining me. If you are to be found online, where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
Maybe someone would be interested in the audiobook version, which is currently available for free on SoundCloud and archive.org.
Oh, okay.
And it's made so far almost entirely with AI voices. But I'm working on getting celebrity cameos, people to read some of the roles. And as soon as I get one, I update the book and release a new version. It's a work in progress.
And then I guess people can also find the book. I'll include links in the show notes where they can buy the book as well. Any social media or anything else like that, or are you not on social media?
No, I'm not really on social media. It's like I try to avoid it because I know I would get addicted if I started.
Smart man. I don't blame you. All right. Well, for myself, you can follow me on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, mainly at stillloadingpodcast.com on Blue Sky, at stillloadingpod on Facebook and Instagram. Also at stillloadingpod over on Twitch, where I stream whenever I'm able to. So if you want to catch me playing some games, you can follow me over on Twitch at StillLoadingPod. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. That does help more people find the show, and it pleases the algorithm gods, or so I'm told, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. You can also support the show monetarily. There is a Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For as little as $1 a month, you get all the episodes like this one a little bit earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which help guide the direction of the show. I do quarterly polls, sometimes more often than that, and you can help pick future topics and games to cover on the show. For $3 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, plus patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get all of that stuff I mentioned, plus 2 mini bonus episodes every month. And for $5 a month, you get everything I mentioned, plus access to my monthly movie podcast, which at the time of this episode coming out is called Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all the guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. But yeah, that's all over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. And that's it. That is all the time I have for you on this episode of Still Loading. Karl, thank you once again for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.
Un poisson croissant, s'il vous plaît. Croissant. Un croissant. Un croissant, s'il vous plaît. Un croissant, s'il vous plaît.